6 Minute English.
From BBC Learning English.
Hello, this is 6 Minute English from BBC Learning English. I'm Neil.
And I'm Georgina.
God namiddagen. Mer lika fet om etternet.
I beg your pardon, Neil? Is something stuck in your throat? Are you speaking a foreign language?
Ha, well, actually, Georgina, I was saying good morning, pleased to meet you, in English, but not the English you and I speak. That was Anglo-Saxon or Old English, the earliest form of English, spoken in the Middle Ages, so between the 5th and 15th century.
It doesn't sound anything like the way people talk nowadays.
No, but it's surprising how many of the words we use today have survived from Old English. Beer, wine, drink, fish, bread, butter, eye, ear, mouth, head, hand, foot, life, love, laughter, mother, daughter, sister, brother, son, father, all Anglo-Saxon words.
Wow, so many everyday words. But what about the classics, Latin and Greek? I thought a lot of English vocabulary came from there.
That's also true. But the history of English is the history of invasions. You know, when the army of one country fights to enter and control another country.
Like the Roman invasion of Britain?
Right, and later invasions too, by Norse-speaking Vikings and Germanic Saxons. In fact, Georgina, that reminds me of my quiz question.
Go on then, but in modern English if you don't mind.
OK, well, the year 1066 is remembered for a famous battle when the French-speaking Norman king, William the Conqueror, invaded England. But what is the name of the famous battle? Is it A, the Battle of Waterloo, B, the Battle of Hastings, or C, the Battle of Trafalgar?
My history's not great, Neil, but I think it's B, the Battle of Hastings.
OK, Georgina, we'll find out later. Another Old English word there. But it's not just words that survive from Anglo-Saxon, it's word endings too. The suffix, or letters added to the end of a word to modify its meaning.
Right, like adding S to make something plural, as in one bird, two birds. Or the ness in goodness and happiness, and dom as in freedom and kingdom.
Poet Michael Rosen is fascinated by Old English. Here he is talking about word suffixes to Oxford University professor Andy Orchard for BBC Radio 4's programme Word of Mouth.
Listen out for the proportion of modern English that comes from Anglo-Saxon.
I walked, the t bit on the end.
Yeah, the ed ending. Most modern verbs, if we were to say, I texted my daughter, text is obviously comes from Latin. I tweeted. We still lapse to the Anglo-Saxon.
And generally, when I'm speaking, just let's do it in mathematical terms, what proportion can we say is Old English? Can we say like about 80% in common parlance? Sorry to use a French word there.
In speech, it will be something like that.
Yeah.
In the written language, less. They're the basic building blocks of who we are and what we think.
Professor Orchard estimates that 80% of spoken English in common parlance comes from Anglo-Saxon. In common parlance means the words and vocabulary that most people use in ordinary, everyday conversation.
So Anglo-Saxon words are the building blocks of English, the basic parts that are put together to make something.
He also thinks that the languages we speak shape the way we see the world.
Here's Michael Rosen and Professor Andy Orchard discussing this idea on BBC Radio 4 programme Word of Mouth.
Can we say that English speakers today, as I'm speaking to you now, view the world through Anglo-Saxon eyes, through Anglo-Saxon words? Can we say that?
Well, certainly in Old English poetry, it's always raining, and I suppose it's always raining today. There is a retrospective element that we're still inhabiting that worldview, those ideas, the same words, the same simple ideas that they inhabited. And what's extraordinary, if you think about the history of English, is despite the invasions by the Norse and by the Normans, and then despite the years of empire where we're bringing things back, the English that we're speaking today is still at its root, Old English word, at its heart, Old English word, still very much English.
Michael Rosen asks if English speakers see the world through Anglo-Saxon eyes. When we see something through someone's eyes, we see it from their perspective, their point of view.
And Professor Orchard replies by saying that despite all the history of invasion and empire, the English we speak today is still Old English at heart, a phrase used to say what something is really like.
Wow, so much history crammed into 6 minutes. And now, time for one more history fact.
Do you mean your quiz question, Neil? What's the name of the famous Battle of 1066?
What did you say, Georgina?
I said B, the Battle of Hastings.
Which was the correct answer. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 played a big part in the Norman conquest and mixing French words into the language.
And I also know how the English ruler King Harold died, shot through the eye with an arrow.
Ouch. Okay, let's recap the vocabulary, some of which exists because of invasions, when one country enters and controls another.
A suffix is added to the end of a word to make a new word.
The phrase in common parlance means using ordinary, everyday words.
Building blocks are the basic parts used to make something.
To see things through someone's eyes means from their point of view.
And finally, at heart is used to say what something is really like.
That's all for this programme. Join us again soon at 6 Minute English, but for now, fahr gesund. That's Old English for goodbye.
Fahr gesund!
6 Minute English.
From BBC Learning English.
Hello, this is 6 Minute English from BBC Learning English. I'm Neil.
And I'm Rob.
Bonjour, Rob. Konnichiwa.
Excuse me?
Hola, ¿cómo estás?
Oh, okay. I think Neil's saying hello in different languages. French, was it? And then Japanese. And Spanish, is that right?
Sí, muy bien. The English are famously slow to learn other languages, but it seems that Rob and I, and of course you, our global audience here at 6 Minute English, are good examples of polyglots, people who speak more than one language, sometimes known as superlinguists. People who speak multiple languages benefit from many advantages, as we'll be hearing in this programme.
That word polyglot sounds familiar, Neil. Doesn't the prefix poly mean many?
That's right, like polygon, a shape with many sides.
Or polymath, someone who knows many things.
And speaking of knowing things, it's time for my quiz question. The word polyglot comes from Greek and is made up of two parts, poly, which as Rob says means many, and glot. But what does glot mean? What is the meaning of the word polyglot? Is it A, many words, B, many sounds, or C, many tongues?
Well, there's 3 syllables in polyglot, Neil, so I reckon it's B, many sounds.
OK, Rob, we'll find out if that's right at the end of the programme. But leaving aside the origins of the word, what exactly does being a polyglot involve? British-born polyglot Richard Simcott speaks 11 languages. Listen to his definition as he speaks to BBC World Service programme The Documentary.
A polyglot, for me, can be anyone who identifies with that term. It's somebody who learns languages that they don't necessarily need for their lives, but just out of sheer enjoyment, pleasure, or fascination with another language or culture.
For Richard, being a polyglot simply means identifying with the idea, feeling that you are similar or closely connected to it.
He says polyglots learn languages not because they have to, but for the sheer enjoyment, which means nothing except enjoyment. Richard uses the word sheer to emphasise how strong and pure this enjoyment is.
As well as the pleasure of speaking other languages, polyglots are also better at communicating with others. My favourite quote by South Africa's first black president, Nelson Mandela, is, "If you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart."
How inspiring, Rob. I'm lost for words. Here's another. To have another language is to possess a second soul.
So language learning is good for the head, heart and soul, a person's spirit, or the part of them which is believed to continue existing after death.
Yes, and what's more, language learning is good for the brain too. That's according to Harvard neuroscientist Eve Fedorenko. She's researched the effects of speaking multiple languages on the brains of growing children.
Eve predicted that multilingual children would have hyperactive language brains. But what she actually found surprised her, as she explains here to BBC World Service's The Documentary.
What we found, this is now people who already have proficiency in multiple languages, what we found is that their language regions appear to be smaller. And that was surprising. And as people get better and better, more automatic at performing the task, the activations shrink, so to speak, over time. So it becomes so that you don't have to use as much brain tissue to do the task as well, right? So you become more efficient.
Eve was testing children who already have language proficiency, the skill and ability to do something, such as speak a language.
Her surprising discovery was that the language regions of these children's brains were shrinking, not because their speaking skills were getting worse, but the opposite. As they learned and repeated language patterns, their brain tissue became more efficient, worked quicker and more effectively.
It suggested that this increased efficiency is a result of exposure to different languages.
So that proves it, Neil. Speaking many languages is good for the head, heart, mind and soul.
You took the words right out of my mouth.
And speaking of words, what does the glot in polyglot actually mean? Was my answer correct?
Ah, that's right. In my quiz question, I asked you for the meaning of the word polyglot.
And I said B, many sounds.
But in fact, the correct answer was C, many tongues. You may be a polyglot, Rob, but you're not quite a polymath yet.
OK, well, let me get my brain tissues working by recapping the vocabulary, starting with polyglot, someone who speaks many languages.
The language centres in a polyglot's brain are efficient. They work quickly and effectively in an organised way.
Proficiency means the skill and ability to do something well. And if you identify with something, you feel that you are similar or closely connected to it.
Polyglots learn languages for the sheer enjoyment of it, a word meaning nothing except, which is used to emphasise the strength of feeling.
So, speaking many languages is good for mind and soul, a person's non-physical spirit, which some believe to continue after death.
That's it for this programme, but to discover more about language learning, including some useful practical tips, check out the Superlinguist series from BBC World Service's The Documentary.
Bye for now.
Bye.
6 Minute English.
From BBC Learning English.
Hello, this is 6 Minute English from BBC Learning English. I'm Neil.
And I'm Sam.
Last weekend I was driving from London to Anglesey in Wales when I saw a road sign written in 2 languages. It said, "Welcome to Wales" in English, and below that it said, "Croeso Gymru" in Welsh.
Yes, Welsh is spoken by many people in North Wales. It's the indigenous language, the language spoken by the people who originally lived in a place, rather than by others who moved there from somewhere else.
Welsh is a good example of an indigenous language that has survived. Some children speak Welsh in school, and the local government has encouraged its spread. But not all indigenous languages have been so lucky, as we'll be finding out in this programme.
Of course, languages are more than just words. They carry people's history, culture, and identity. So when an indigenous language disappears, so too does the culture.
Yes, the dominance of international languages, including English, has endangered other less spoken languages. So here's my quiz question, Sam. Did you know that nearly 7,000 different languages are spoken around the world, but how many of them are indigenous? Is it A, 3,000, B, 4,000, or C, 5,000?
I'll say B, 4,000 languages.
OK, Sam, we'll find out the answer at the end of the programme.
One indigenous language speaker is Mishko Gabwyd Kwe. She's from Canada, or Turtle Island as it's called by her tribe. She grew up speaking English instead of her native language, Anishi Nabemoan, which she only learned later as an adult.
Listen to Mishka Gabwyd speaking with BBC World Service programme The Conversation about how she felt learning Anishinaabe later in life.
When I realized that the sounds that were coming out of my mouth are the same sounds that had come out of my ancestors' mouths thousands of years ago, I felt a deep sense of who I was and what it means to be Anishinaabe, and it made me realize that my dream of learning this language and passing it on to my children was now accessible, was now reachable, attainable. And, you know, after a couple of months, I was able to understand one full prayer that was said at a ceremony feast, and the glee in me and the feeling of joy of being able to understand something in my own language, it was the most profound sense of confidence.
Learning to speak the language of her ancestors gave Mishko Gabwid glee, a feeling of happiness, pleasure or excitement.
Although she didn't grow up speaking Anishinaabe-Moan, she now wants to pass it on to her children. To pass something on means to give it to someone, usually in your family, who lives on after you die.
Mishko Gabwid's decision to raise her children speaking Anishinaabe-Moan turned out to be the right one, as she explained to BBC World Service programme The Conversation.
There's lots of bumps in the road, but it's going very well. My daughter is turning 4 and she completely understands the language. Being put back into daycare, which she's only been there for maybe a month, has really influenced her English. So I noticed she's speaking a lot of English, and so that was a little bit rough for the family, being in an immersion home where we only speak Anishinaabe in the home, for there to be so much English. And only recently, over the last week and a half, have we really noticed her switch and her shift back into using the language.
Bringing up her children to speak her Indigenous language wasn't easy, and Mishka Gabwid said there were some bumps in the road, small problems or delays that slowed down or stopped things from developing.
To help, her family spoke only Anishinaabe-Moan at home, using a technique called immersion, the process of learning a language or skill by using only that and nothing else.
This meant that Mishka Gabwid's children spoke both English at school and Anishinaabe-Moan at home. She noticed how they changed between languages when speaking, something known as code switching.
Mishko Gabwid believes this not only helps her children's development, but also gives them a sense of family history, as well as preserving her traditional culture.
A culture she hopes they will pass on to their children in turn.
So while Indigenous cultures are threatened by big global languages, there's still hope that many will survive into the future. Which reminds me of your quiz question, Neil. Was my answer right?
Ah, yes. I asked Sam how many of the 7,000 languages spoken around the world are indigenous.
And I thought it was B, 4,000 languages.
Which was the correct answer. And what's amazing is that although indigenous peoples make up under 6% of the global population, they speak more than 4,000 of the world's languages.
Okay, Neil, let's recap the vocabulary from this programme on Indigenous languages. Languages spoken by the people who originally lived in a place, rather than others who came later.
Glee is a feeling of happiness or excitement.
If you pass something on, you give it to someone, usually in your family, who lives on after you.
A bump in the road is a small problem or delay that slows things down.
Immersion is the process of learning something, like a language or a skill, by using only that and nothing else.
And finally, code switching is the ability to change between 2 or more languages when speaking.
That's all from us.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
6 Minute English.
From BBC Learning English.
Hello, this is 6 Minute English from BBC Learning English. I'm Rob.
And I'm Sam.
In this programme, we'll be unlocking the secrets of the ancient Egyptians, pyramid builders and the inventors of hieroglyphs, a writing system which uses pictures and symbols to represent words.
The meaning of Egyptian hieroglyphs remained a mystery until 1799, when Napoleon's soldiers unearthed a dark, damaged rock in the Egyptian coastal town of Rosetta.
On the broken granite stone, 3 scripts were faintly carved: Greek at the bottom, Demotic in the middle, and hieroglyphs at the top. Today, the Rosetta Stone is perhaps the most famous museum object in the world. But what's actually written on it is quite dull. In fact, the Rosetta Stone contains a tax break. It describes an agreement exempting priests from paying taxes to the king.
Ah, the famous Egyptian pharaohs.
Exactly. But which one, Sam? Let's test your ancient Egyptian knowledge with this quiz question. The writing on the Rosetta Stone is a tax agreement between the priests and which Egyptian pharaoh? Is it A, Cleopatra, B, Ptolemy, or C, Ramesses?
I'll guess A, Cleopatra.
OK, Sam, I'll reveal the answer to that mystery later on. Before the discovery of the stone, no scholar had been able to understand the strange symbols carved on the Great Pyramids.
Egyptologist Richard Parker was in charge of the Rosetta Stone exhibition at the British Museum for 20 years. Here he is telling BBC Radio 4 programme In Our Time about circumstances before the discovery of the stone.
People were exploring all sorts of means of trying to decipher, including trying to link the script with Chinese to see if that offered a parallel. It was known from the classical authors that the Egyptian script contained great mysterious pearls of wisdom from the Egyptian philosophers, and people had hugely high expectations, and all attempts to decipher, to get a grip on the script, I think had really failed.
Before the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, no one had managed to decipher hieroglyphs, to work out the meaning of writing, which is difficult to read.
Experts hoped that the Egyptian script contained great pearls of wisdom, wise words, sayings, or advice.
As we know, the actual meaning of the text turned out to be quite dull, but it was the fact that the messages were written in 3 scripts, including Greek, a language scholars already knew, that provided the key to finally crack the code.
In 1801, the race was on between Egyptologists in Britain and France to be the first to translate the entire system of hieroglyphs.
In the end, it was a young Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion who became the first person to understand hieroglyphs since the ancient Egyptians themselves, nearly 2,000 years earlier.
Here's Penelope Wilson, Professor of Egyptian Archaeology at Durham University, explaining more about this remarkable young Frenchman to BBC Radio 4's In Our Time.
He was certainly a prodigy, I think, as far as language is concerned, but also had a fascination for Egypt, I think. And the story is he was taught Coptic by a Coptic priest, and at that lecture was one of the first to argue that Coptic was related to ancient Egyptian. So he was also encouraged by this by his older brother. So I think there seemed to be no holding him back. Once he got the bug, he was encouraged and he made great strides.
When Penelope Wilson calls Champollion a prodigy, she means someone young with a great natural talent for something, in this case, studying languages.
Added to his natural ability was a fascination with Egypt and the encouragement of his brother. So Champollion soon got the bug, suddenly developed a strong enthusiasm for something.
In English, we often add a noun to describe exactly what someone is enthusiastic about. So, for example, the skiing bug for someone who loves to ski.
Champollion was so enthusiastic there was no holding him back. An idiom to say that you are doing something so eagerly you cannot be stopped.
The story goes that he worked so hard deciphering hieroglyphs. When he finally finished, he ran through the streets of Paris shouting, "I've done it!" before collapsing unconscious.
Rob, earlier you asked me which pharaoh ordered the stone to be written.
Yes, and what did you say?
I thought it was Cleopatra. Was I right?
Well, Cleopatra was from the same dynasty, but a little later than the correct answer, which was B, Ptolemy, the pharaoh who ruled from around 300 BCE.
Okay, let's recap the vocabulary we've learned, starting with hieroglyphs, symbols used to represent words in ancient Egypt.
The challenge was to decipher them, to uncover the meaning of writing, which is difficult to read or understand.
Maybe they contained pearls of wisdom, wise words, sayings, or advice.
The hieroglyphic code was finally cracked by Jean-François Champollion, a prodigy or young person with a great natural talent.
When Champollion got the bug, or suddenly became very enthusiastic about understanding hieroglyphs, there was no holding him back. Nothing could stop him from succeeding.
And nothing can stop us from saying goodbye, because our 6 minutes are up.
Goodbye.
6 Minute English.
From BBC Learning English.
Hello, this is 6 Minute English from BBC Learning English. I'm Sam.
And I'm Neil. How are you today, Sam?
Thanks for asking, Neil. I'm fine. Not.
Sorry, so are you fine or not?
Oh, did I confuse you? My bad.
Sam is speaking English, just a very modern type of English. For example, saying my bad instead of my fault as a way of accepting that she's wrong.
or adding not at the end of a sentence to show I really mean the opposite of what I said. Both are examples of small changes in English which have happened naturally over the last decade or two.
Changes like these happen because, unlike, say, Latin, which no one speaks day to day, English is a living language, a language people speak and use in their ordinary lives.
New bits of English are invented as people use the language in new ways. But what happens when a language comes from an entirely different galaxy? Somewhere like Kronos, home planet of the Klingons.
Yes, when sci-fi TV show Star Trek introduced alien characters called Klingons, the makers needed to invent a whole new language, Klingon.
Entirely made up and unrelated to any human language, Klingon has developed a life of its own. Today, you can even study it at university. So, Neil, my quiz question is this. In 2010, Klingon became the first invented language to do what? Is it A, have its own dictionary, B, have an opera written, or C, be recognised as an official language by the United Nations?
Every language needs vocabulary, so I'll say A, Klingon was the first invented language to have its own dictionary.
OK, Neil, I'll reveal the answer later in the programme. Klingon isn't the only made-up language invented for the movies. David Peterson is the creator of Dothraki, a language used in the fantasy TV show Game of Thrones.
From his home in Los Angeles, David spoke to Michael Rosen, presenter of BBC Radio 4 programme Word of Mouth. They discussed St. Hildegard, who created the very first made-up language in the 12th century.
What she had was an entire list of nouns, a whole list of nouns, many of them godly, many of them not. And she would drop them into songs using Latin grammar and other Latin words. And so that it's not a language proper as the way that we understand it now. Because really when we talk about a language, it's not just the vocabulary, it's the grammar. Nevertheless, we still kind of look on her as the patron saint of modern conlang.
St. Hildegard invented new nouns but used Latin grammar, so David doesn't think her invention is a proper language. Nevertheless, St. Hildegard is considered the patron saint of made-up languages.
The patron saint of something refers to a Christian saint who is believed to give special help to a particular activity. Here the activity is inventing a conlang, short for constructed language, artificially invented languages like Klingon and Dothraki.
Another famous constructed language, Esperanto, was invented in 1887 by Polish doctor Ludwik Zamenhof. He wanted to make it easier for people who spoke different languages to communicate with each other.
Listen as David Peterson speaks Esperanto with Michael Rosen and tests how much he understands for BBC Radio 4 programme Word of Mouth.
You are an English speaker from Western Europe. And in the 19th century, universal meant able to be understood by people from Western Europe. And so, for example, to say, I speak Esperanto, mi parolas Esperanton.
Yes, I might have got that one. The parl bit from its Latin root and me, obviously. Try me again.
Kiel vi fartas?
Who is my father? No. Where am I travelling? No, I got stuck on that one.
Like Spanish, Italian, and other modern European languages, Esperanto is based on Latin. Michael guessed the meaning of the Esperanto word parolas from its Latin root, the origin or source of a language.
But the second sentence of Esperanto isn't so easy. Michael gets stuck on that one. He can't answer because it's too difficult.
I think I'd probably get stuck on that as well. But at least Esperanto was invented for humans, not alien creatures from outer space.
And speaking of creatures from outer space, did I get the right answer to your quiz question, Sam?
So I asked Neil about an unusual first achieved by the made-up alien language Klingon.
I guessed it was the first invented language to have its own dictionary.
Which was the wrong answer, I'm afraid, Neil. Incredibly, the correct answer was B. In 2010, a company of Dutch musicians and singers performed the first ever Klingon opera. The story must have been hard to follow, but I'm sure the singing was out of this world.
Madka. That's Klingon for great, apparently. OK, let's recap the vocabulary from our discussion about invented languages, also called constructed languages, or conlangs for short.
A living language, like English, is a language that people still speak and use in their ordinary lives.
The phrase my bad originated in the United States, but is also used in Britain as an informal way to say my fault, or to tell someone that you've made a mistake.
A patron saint is someone believed to give special help and protection to a particular activity.
The root of a language means its origin or source.
And finally, if you get stuck on something, you're unable to complete it because it's too difficult.
That's all the time we have for this programme about invented languages. Gis revido baldao. That's Esperanto for see you again soon.
In other words, kapla, which is how Klingons say goodbye, I think. Kapla.
Kapla.
6 Minute English.
From BBC Learning English.